Welcome back to another episode of Stack Racks TV, Stack Rack Boxing, where we do talk boxing, but we also talk shit at the same time. It's just depending on what the video is, really, right? Main purpose of this channel, primary purpose of this channel, the prerogative of this channel is for y'all to sit back, relax, Mac Jack, Slack Jack, and Jack. Today we're going to be talking about Brian Norman Jr. making his return to the sport of boxing in 2026. And some opponents that I think will help build his stock in the sport of boxing and get him back to the top of the 147-pound division. In order for Brian Norman Jr. to make a return to the sport of boxing and have that same effect that he had on the sport of boxing prior to fighting Devin Haney, I think he needs to add a new coach, fire his father, and get a coach that's more fundamentally sound, right? Brian Norman Jr. is a fighter that needs to work on his fundamentals. He has power. When he catch you, he can hurt you. When he catch you, he can drop you. But, in order for you to land big shots, especially those big shots that he looks to land throughout a fight, you're going to have to start setting those type of shots up against guys, especially when you're moving up in competition, right? Unfortunately for Brian Norman Jr., his main claim to fame is a big punch. And unfortunately, a big punch becomes less and less valuable, the more that you move up in competition. And like I said before, if he could start adding certain nuances to his game, he could come back to the sport of boxing and be a threat, especially if he starts learning how to work behind his jab, using his feet in the ring, controlling his pace, fighting at his pace. But as long as he keeps the same style, the same training camps, the same coaches, we're going to get the same results with Brian Norman Jr. I believe a great fight for Brian Norman Jr. coming back to the sport of boxing in 2026 will be against a guy like Jack Catterall, a guy like Liam Paro, guys with skills, guys who can box. Both of those fighters are below average boxers. So, that'll gauge where he's at, especially after that fight with Devin Haney, fundamentally. Right? I believe that he could beat both of those guys, but, he's going to need some level of skill in there, not just a big punch to be able to defeat those guys, right? Liam Paro is not the best boxer, nor is Jack Catterall, but guys like that prepare you to move up in competition. You fight a couple below average boxers, move up to a few average boxers, and boom, you ready under the lights to go against more elite boxers like a Shakur Stevenson or Richardson Hitchens, possibly even setting up a rematch with Devin Haney. I believe that Brian Norman Jr. can make a comeback, but he has to work on the fundamentals. He has to get touches against guys who are solid boxers, to prepare him to fight elite caliber boxers, right? But, he can't come back, without a strategy. They have to have a strategy bringing him back, because unfortunately, in the sport of boxing, you can't control every matchup. Every matchup is not going to be in your favor. Sometimes you got to go in there and fight a slick boxer. And I think that if he gets some of those soft touches against below average boxers, it'll ultimately prepare him to fight against boxers who are a lot more elite.